They used to laugh at it. That was the first thing American pilots heard when they arrived in England in 1943. German radio operators mocked it openly. Luftwaffe pilots joked about it over their mess tables. Even Allied crews called it the 7-ton milk jug. And at first glance, the P-47 Thunderbolt did look like something that had no business being in the sky. Huge, round, heavy, more like a flying oil drum than a fighter. The Germans couldn't resist. "It's too heavy," they said. "It climbs like a brick. It can't dogfight our Messerschmitts, and it certainly can't reach us at altitude." For months, this became a routine part of German propaganda. Mock the Thunderbolt, painted as a lumbering American mistake, and assured the Luftwaffe pilots that they had nothing to worry about. But then came the reports. At first, they were confusing, almost unbelievable. German fighter groups began claiming that P-47s were suddenly appearing above them, at altitudes the Thunderbolt was never supposed to reach. Some pilots insisted the Americans must have switched to a new aircraft entirely. Others said the Thunderbolt had been secretly redesigned. But the truth was far more shocking. Nothing had changed except the Germans' understanding of what the Thunderbolt was actually capable of. It started with a single encounter. A group of Bf-109s dove on an American formation. Confident, they held the high ground. They expected the usual. P-47s flailing below them, trying desperately to climb. Instead, one Thunderbolt broke away from the pack and began rising. Fast. Much faster than anything that big had any right to climb. Within seconds, the Germans watched in disbelief as the slow, heavy brick simply kept gaining altitude. The air thinned. The Messerschmitt engine struggled. But the Thunderbolt, thanks to a secret the Germans had never even considered, did not slow down. In that moment, German pilots realized something that would shake their confidence for the rest of the war. The Thunderbolt they mocked was about to outclimb their best fighters, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. This is the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt went from a battlefield joke to a high-altitude monster the Luftwaffe feared, and why everything the Germans thought they knew about it was dead wrong. To understand why the Germans were so confident and why the P-47 shattered that confidence, we need to go back to its origins. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to be elegant. It wasn't designed to win beauty contests or look sleek in propaganda posters. It was designed for one thing: survival. When Republic Aviation first proposed the aircraft, even some American engineers thought the concept was insane. A fighter that large, that heavy, with a radial engine the size of a small car? It didn't match the image of the nimble, knife-fighting aircraft that dominated early war dogfights. But the U.S. Army Air Forces understood something many others overlooked. The war was changing. Dogfights at low altitude were becoming less important. What mattered now was escorting bombers, surviving flak, climbing high, diving fast, and hitting hard. So they built the Thunderbolt around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a monster capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. But an engine alone couldn't explain what was coming next. The real breakthrough wasn't the power. It was the air. Or more specifically, what the Thunderbolt could do with thin, freezing, high-altitude air that suffocated most aircraft of the era. Because attached to that monstrous engine was a supercharger, not the simple engine-mounted kind found on many fighters. The Thunderbolt used a turbo-supercharger system that took up nearly the entire belly of the aircraft. Pipes, ducts, turbines. It looked like someone had stuffed a locomotive inside the fuselage. This system allowed the P-47 to inhale thin air at 30,000 feet and compress it until the engine felt like it was flying at sea level. While German engines gasped at altitude, the Thunderbolt kept its full power. And that changed everything. But here's the twist. Early American pilots didn't know how to use this advantage. They traded the Thunderbolt like a heavy version of earlier fighters, trying to turn, trying to climb the old-fashioned way. And in those early encounters, the Germans saw exactly what they wanted to see: a huge American fighter struggling to keep up. So the legend began. The Thunderbolt is too heavy. It can't climb. It's no match for the Bf-109 or FW-190. And the Germans believed it completely. But beneath the mockery, beneath the confidence, beneath the propaganda, a storm was building. Because the Americans were learning, they were adapting, and once they unlocked the true power of that turbo-supercharger, the Luftwaffe was about to face a fighter they had never imagined and were completely unprepared for. The turning point didn't happen in a grand battle or a carefully planned mission. It happened on an ordinary morning, during an escort run that looked like 100 missions before it. But this time, one squadron commander decided he was done playing by the old rules. His name was Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of the boldest and sharpest minds in the entire USAAF. Zemke had studied the Thunderbolt obsessively. While others complained about the weight, he saw something different: potential. Raw, unexplored, misunderstood potential. He realized the P-47 wasn't meant to dogfight horizontally. It wasn't meant to circle, twist, and turn like a Spitfire. No, the P-47 was built for vertical combat, for climbing like a rocket and diving like a meteor. And Zemke believed that if used properly, the Thunderbolt could dominate the very airspace the Germans believed they owned. So that morning, as his squadron climbed to meet their B-17s, Zemke gave an order no one expected. Take her up, higher than they think we can. At first, the pilots hesitated. The Germans always attacked from above, always. Climbing meant walking straight into the enemy's advantage. But Zemke had run the numbers. He had tested the supercharger himself, and he knew something the Luftwaffe didn't. The Thunderbolt's true power band didn't even start until most fighters were already gasping. So they climbed 20,000 feet, 25,000, 28,000. The air thinned. Frost formed on the canopy, and then they saw them. A swarm of Bf-109s positioned exactly where they always were, hovering above the bomber stream, waiting to pounce. But this time, the Germans weren't above the Americans. They were level with them. Some were even slightly below. The radio crackled with confused German chatter. No one understood how the Thunderbolts had reached their altitude so quickly. Zemke didn't wait. Dive and hit them. They won't expect it. The Thunderbolts rolled over and dove, fast, faster than anything the Germans had ever seen from those 7-ton milk jugs. The turbo-supercharger kept the engine roaring at full power. The airframe, built like a tank, held together even as the speedometer pushed toward the red. The Germans panicked. Their 109s tried to dive after them, but the thin air robbed their engines of power. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts sliced through the formation like falling stars, guns blazing, scattering the Luftwaffe in seconds. That single engagement rewrote everything the Germans thought they knew. Their altitude advantage was gone. Their confidence was shaken, and the Thunderbolt, once a joke, had revealed its true nature. From that day on, the Luftwaffe would never underestimate it again. The Luftwaffe's confusion after that battle wasn't just emotional, it was technical. For years, German pilots had studied American planes and believed they understood every weakness. But the Thunderbolt had a secret they never fully grasped, a piece of engineering so ahead of its time that even some American pilots underestimated it. The heart of the P-47's advantage was its turbo-supercharger system. While most fighters used mechanical superchargers that lost efficiency at high altitude, the Thunderbolt carried a massive, sophisticated turbo unit that kept shoving dense air into the engine no matter how thin the atmosphere became. At low altitude, it was impressive. At high altitude, it was unstoppable. The higher it climbed, the more it embarrassed the competition. But the supercharger was only part of the equation. What truly made the German pilots scratch their heads was what happened after the climb, the dive. German fighters like the Bf-109 and FW-190 were agile, quick, and lethal, no question, but they weren't built to dive at extreme speeds. Their engines starved for oxygen, their airframes shook violently, and their controls stiffened to the point of being nearly unusable. Meanwhile, the P-47 had something they didn't: mass and stability. Its heavy frame wasn't a weakness, it was a feature. In a dive, weight becomes momentum. Momentum becomes speed. And speed, combined with American engineering that kept the controls responsive, even under crushing forces, became dominance. German pilots reported again and again that Thunderbolts dropped like stones, but stones don't maneuver at the bottom of the fall. P-47s did. They could pull out sooner, climb back faster, and return to the fight before the Germans understood what happened. And then there was the firepower. 8.5 caliber Browning machine guns, each one capable of turning aluminum and steel into confetti. German aircraft were tough, but they weren't built to withstand a storm like that. When a P-47 opened fire, it didn't shoot, it erased whatever it pointed at. The Thunderbolt's combination of altitude power, diving velocity, and brute force firepower created a tactical formula the Germans were never able to solve. They could outturn the P-47, they could outclimb it in short bursts, but they couldn't stop it from dictating the terms of the fight. And that was the secret. The Thunderbolt didn't need to win every fight in every direction. It only needed to force the fight into the one direction where it was unbeatable. Straight down, then straight back up. Once the Americans understood that, the skies over Europe changed forever. The climax of the Thunderbolt story came on a day the Germans thought they had the Americans exactly where they wanted them. It was late 1944. The Luftwaffe was desperate, and they sent everything they had, veterans, rookies, experimental upgrades, into the sky to stop the endless surge of Allied bombers. That morning, the B-17s were flying deeper into Germany than ever before. The mission was critical: destroy a synthetic fuel plant the Nazis depended on for the survival of their armored divisions. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where the bombers were headed, and they set a massive aerial trap to stop them. Dozens of German fighters swarmed in from above, just like every mission before. But this time, instead of scrambling from below, the Thunderbolts were already waiting at 30,000 feet. Hub Zemke and his pilots looked down and saw the German formation stacked below them, perfectly arranged for a strike. Zemke keyed his radio and calmly said the words that would later be etched into the history of air combat. Let's give them the high-altitude welcome. The Thunderbolts rolled over and dove. The sky turned into a tunnel of speed. P-47s howled as they plummeted, engines screaming, 850 cows ready to speak. The Germans looked up just in time to realize the impossible was happening. Americans were attacking them from above. The first pass was devastating. German fighters scattered in panic as Thunderbolts ripped through their formation, shredding aircraft before many pilots even saw their attackers. The 109s tried to dive away, but at that altitude, diving meant suicide. Their airframes shuddered dangerously, and they couldn't keep up with the massive American machines built to survive terminal velocity. Zemke made a wide turn and came back around. Below him, the battle had collapsed into chaos. German fighters dove too steeply and overshot. Others tried to climb but stalled out, and everywhere, thunderbolts cascaded up and down the vertical column of sky, dictating every moment of the fight. Then, the Americans did something the Germans never expected. After the dive attack, they didn't peel off and break away. The Thunderbolts pulled up, climbed hard, and prepared for a second strike. Something no other Allied fighter could have done that quickly at that altitude. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time the bombers reached their target, the sky ahead of them was empty. The Luftwaffe's trap had failed completely. That day became one of the worst losses for German fighter forces late in the war. Their myth of high-altitude superiority, gone. And the P-47, once mocked as too big, too heavy, and too slow, had become the hammer that shattered the Luftwaffe's last hopes.
In the years that followed, veterans who had flown that mission would talk about it with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. Many of them said the same thing. The P-47 shouldn't have been able to do what it did that day, but somehow it did. Some pilots remembered how quiet the bomber crews became after the Germans disappeared. No cheering, no celebrating, just a stunned silence, like everyone was processing the same impossible thought. We survived because those Thunderbolts didn't give up. Historians later called it one of the most decisive defensive stands of the war. It didn't just save a bomber wing, it changed how the Germans viewed American air power. For the Germans, the message was terrifyingly clear. If the Americans had fighters that could climb like that, dive like that, and keep fighting at any altitude, they no longer had a safe place in the sky. And for the P-47 pilots, that mission became something deeper. Not fame, not glory, but proof. Proof that their aircraft, the so-called flying bulldozer, could rise to the moment when everything was on the line. Some of them kept photos of their Thunderbolts long after the war. Others kept fragments of metal from the fuselage or a worn-down patch from their jacket. But all of them kept the same memory. That freezing day above Germany, when they were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outpositioned, and still refused to lose. Looking back, one pilot summed it up perfectly in an interview decades later. He said, "We weren't the best pilots. We just had the best plane, and the right moment to prove it." Today, the story of that mission lives on not because it was a victory, but because of what it represented. Resilience, teamwork, and the raw determination to protect the men flying behind you. And somewhere, in a museum or an airfield far from the roar of war, a restored P-47 sits in the sun, massive, quiet, unassuming. A reminder that sometimes the most unlikely hero is the one built like a tank, sounds like thunder, and refuses, absolutely refuses, to let anyone down.